let's have a chat about the philosophy behind the ideological civil war that's going on in the United States. Because this is something, one of the Congress women we just watched was Stacey Plaskett. She was the younger black woman we just saw. And she had a very short clip with the BBC where she described what was taking place as an ideological civil war in the United States. And she's not wrong. There is an ideological civil war. And so I thought that we'd try and explore the structure of it very briefly, just to see exactly why the Democrats appear to have gone nuts, because they have. So let's begin with the view of government, because this is something that is deeply embedded in Democrat rhetoric. Joe Biden and the Democrats, we can go to the next one, keep calling the Capitol building sacred. Do you consider government buildings to be sacred, Leo? I consider them to be little better than public toilets, much like some of the protesters.
Yeah. Except the government buildings are still open.
And so this, I mean, literally Joe Biden calls it a sacred place that our democracy was attacked. In his speech, in Kamala Harris's speech, and if you can go to the next one, she called it hallowed in her speech, this hallowed building. If you can get to the next one, you can see senators posting saying, well, it's sacred. This one, I can't remember. Yeah, hundreds of lives, our sacred capital. It's like, is it sacred? Like, what are you talking about? This is religious rhetoric they're using about the Capitol building. If we can go to the next one,
there's
another
supposedly secular country.
In a supposedly secular country. Another one, again, protect our sacred Capitol building. They all keep using these kinds of language, this kind of language. And this is coming from the very top. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, senators. And so this filters down to the activists who also, if you can go to the next one, call it sacred. Our democracy is sacred. Oh, sacred, sacred, sacred. This is all imbued by the will of God, I guess. And of course, this then filters down to just random Twitter plebs who end up saying things like, if we can go to the next one, I keep hearing people say we should have been prepared, saw it coming. I personally could have never imagined my fellow Americans desecrating our sacred Capitol building. Desecrating the sacred Capitol building.
What about people's homes and businesses? Are they not sacred?
Clearly not.
They're allowed to be burnt because that's a legitimate expression of anger against things that happened 400 years ago.
Yes. Now, speaking of things that happened 400 years ago, the Capitol building was built by slaves. Now, this, you would think, in a different Democrat narrative, and in fact, a previous Democrat narrative before January the 6th was in fact the narrative of, well, this is proof that America is a white supremacist, racist country. I mean, the Capitol building's built by slaves and we all are operating in it, and therefore. And so this chap is Jesse Holland. He wrote a book just called Black Men Built the Capitol, and just talking about how 600 people worked on the Capitol and 400 of those were black slaves.
Right.
So there we go. Yeah, that seems to be true. You know, I've looked into this previously. This seems to be a true statement.
And so we shouldn't pull it down and throw it in Bristol Harbour?
I guess not. It's really weird, isn't it? But no, it's sacred capital that was built by racist slavery, you know? And so let's move on. This turns the US government into a form of religion, this sacral nature and the holy temple that is the Capitol building, turning the state into God and therefore the founding fathers into prophets. Straight white male prophets.
Yeah.
Which 6 months ago were, terrible. I mean, you can find like articles like this in the Sacramento Times or something for the founding fathers. Only white men deserved rights. Oh, these are the sort of prophets, progressive prophets, that they're forced to adopt now because they've adopted the position that the state is God. As cliche as that sounds, that's what their rhetoric is. That's the locus of their affections.
And also they'll be subverting the meaning of the word democracy. So democracy won't mean, a multi-party system anymore. It means just the Democrats. And, anything that you can do to keep the Democrats in power is democracy. And anything that Trump does to come back into power,
is a threat to our democracy.
Yeah, that's a threat to democracy.
Exactly.
Instead of actually, that's what democracy is.
Exactly, and that's exactly how they've arrived at anything the Republicans do is a threat to our democracy. Right. Our democracy. Yeah, it's their democracy, which is where the state is God. It's their religion, but the Republicans, the state is not God. But anyway, so just carrying on with this second. The leaders of this country at its founding were mostly rich white men. Oh yeah, I can see why the Democrats are now calling them prophets. In fact, many citizens weren't even allowed to vote because they didn't own enough property. Rich white men liked being the 1% of their day, and they kept their money and privileges in the hands of said rich white men. Everyone else was there to maintain the system, as well as the slaves, I assume. And in fact, these were prophets who owned slaves. We can go to the next one. George Washington had 123 slaves. Thomas Jefferson had 600 slaves. A bunch of others had other slaves. How is it that the very racially aware, the Democrat Party that has the pedigree of the crimes of the United States under its belt and mostly in its own history, we're talking about slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, all these other, literally all of the bad things in the racial history of the United States were under the KKK, were under the Democrats.
Yeah.
So, the fact that they're now like, oh yeah, and they've got to praise Lincoln, who founded the Republican Party. And so like they've suddenly turned on a dime. It's like, why? Because they're deifying the state. And so what does all of this come from, right? Now, I think this all comes directly from Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a French Enlightenment thinker who wrote The Social Contract, I think it was about 1762, so a decade or so before the United States Revolution. And I'm going to read a few bits from you to you, and I want you to give me your opinion on it, right? So the problem that Rousseau is trying to solve is he wants to find a form of association which may defend and protect with the whole force of the community, the person and property of every associate, and by means of each coalescing with all, may nevertheless only obey himself and remain as free as before, right? And so the essence of the social contract that's page 14. Page 15, he says, the essence of the social contract therefore becomes each of us puts in common his person and his whole power under the supreme direction of the general will. And in return, we receive every member as an indivisible part of the whole.
Right.
That sounds terrifying, doesn't it?
I didn't really understand it because it's written in sort of old-fashioned language.
Yeah. So
it's basically communism, is it?
Fascism.
Fascism.
Each of us puts in common his person and his whole power, so everything about you, under the supreme direction of the general will.
Will of the people, which is, that's sort of what they say in communism, but then the will of the people is actually
the will of the dictator.
The will of the dictator, the person in top, the general secretary of the party and his few crony apparatchiks.
We'll get to that. So this general will, this incorporation of the entire thing, where everyone's under the entire power of it, is called something he calls the public person.
Right.
There's an abstract entity called the public person that represents the totality of the general will, right? He says, this public person, which is thus formed by the union of all individual members, formerly took the name of city, but now takes the name of republic or body politic, which is called by its member states when it's... which is called by its members the state when it is passive, sovereign when it's active, and power when it's compared to similar bodies. So he's saying that this public person, the thing he's just magicked into existence, is now the state. That's the state. And so this sovereign state is above all laws. He says, it's contrary to the nature of the body politic for the sovereign to impose on itself a law that it cannot transgress. So it's not bound by any laws. It can change everything within it, and all must be subjected to the general will of the state. He says, whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the whole body, which means nothing else than he shall be forced to be free. So if the dictator says you can't do that, the entire civilization will turn on you and make you do the thing that the dictator's telling you to do. And that will be called freedom.
Right. Doesn't sound like freedom.
No, it sounds like tyranny, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's mad tyranny, right? And so he says that this is something that we have to essentially abandon our own autonomy in exchange for the civil liberties that will be provided by the state. He says, what man loses by the social contract is his natural liberty and an unlimited right which tempts him and which he is able to attain, and what he gains is civil liberty and in property, civil liberty and property in all that he possesses. So you'll lose your natural right to own the things you want, but the state will provide you with rights instead, civil rights.
Yeah.
And so these civil rights can be constructed by the state. So they can be anything. They could be the right to healthcare, housing.
Yeah.
They could be the right to be called a specific kind of pronoun.
Yeah.
They can be anything they want. The normal people believe like your natural rights are inherent within you.
Yeah.
So you can't.
And they can't be a burden on anybody else.
No.
So healthcare is a socialized healthcare is a nice thing to have. It's a great, like the NHS. It's a nice thing to have, but it can't be a right, because then what if
What if there are no doctors?
What if there are no doctors? Then, or there's one doctor, and he's got to be held at gunpoint to work 24 hours a day to treat everybody in the country.
Literally, like in Cuba, where the doctor said we were slaves. They literally did this, right? But that's exactly it. Because what you're saying is, if rights are natural, then the number of rights is always equal to the number of people. It can't be expanded or contracted. But Jeremy Corbyn, who thinks that anything that's in the front of his mind at that time, broadband is a human right.
Yeah.
How?
It's a nice thing to have. And actually, it's a nice thing to have provided by the private sector, which will provide it much more efficiently and cheaply due to competitiveness. I mean,
Which it has done.
I've worked in government. And
Yeah.
the amount of just corruption and waste and profligacy. I mean, there's 4 ways you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself. You can spend your own money on someone else. You can spend someone else's money on yourself, or you can spend someone else's money on someone else. And obviously, if you're spending your own money on yourself, you're going to get a good deal because you know exactly what you want, and it's important to you to spend the money the best.
Yeah.
So you're going to be careful. If you're spending someone else's money on someone else, you don't care at all. And and layer onto that, you got the fact that a lot of people in the public sector are corrupt, especially in Scotland. But we see that with COVID contracts, for example, like Transparency International says that 20% of the fast track VIP COVID contracts are dodgy or potentially corrupt. And you can see with Owen Patterson, 20%. It's insane.
Christ.
You can see Michelle Mone, Owen Patterson, Matt Hancock's former pub landlord. It sounds like a sitcom, but these are all contracts where they're creaming off hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money and feathering their cronies' nests and getting backhanders themselves. And that's an incentive for them to continue lockdown. So it leads to ineffective government that isn't in the best interest of the people.
Yep. But all of this comes from the idea that the government is essentially a god. But anyway, moving back to Rousseau quickly, he says that, you're going to gain a civil liberty and the property that you will possess from the state. He says the state, with regards to its members, is the owner of all their property by the social contract, which in the state serves as the basis of all rights. So the social contract, this thing that he's made up, is the basis of all rights, and therefore, and everything in the society, all property in the society is owned by the state and is essentially delegated by the state. So you only own your property at the pleasure of the government, of the pleasure of the dictator, the general will. And this is why the left consider children the property of the state. And the rights are just created by their own dictates.
Yeah, and they literally bring through, so the SNP brought through legislation, the Named Person Act, which was scrapped, but it basically wrote into law that you're not responsible for your own children, the state is responsible. And you can see, like all these things, they probably come from a good place originally, so...
this is where it originally comes from, so no, it's not.
No, but like hate crime laws and stuff like that, that comes from the McPherson report, which, obviously a terrible crime, should have been seen in advance and headed off, and the murder of Stephen Lawrence could have been avoided. But you've got terrible parents. Sometimes in Scotland, you've got parents who are on drugs, who can't take care of their kids and all the rest of it. But to then go in and say, okay, for all parents, you're not responsible for your children. The state is, and bear in mind, the state is a huge organisation made of people, and people have horrible motives sometimes. So there could be paedophiles working.
Even let's assume you get a well-meaning person. They just don't care. They're not invested in your children like you are invested in your children.
It's someone else's money on someone else. So
exactly.
They're removed from it. They're not invested.
Exactly. 5 o'clock. Sorry, I'm clocking off now. Bye.
Oh, you think public sector people clock off at 5 o'clock?
Well, okay. 3:25.
Clocking
off. Yeah, exactly. But you know what I mean? Like this is just their job, and that's as far as it goes. And so this is the thing. He believes the state literally owns everything, right? And the point of all of this is for equality. Isn't that just the most important value?
World.
He says the fundamental pact, the social contract, substitutes a moral and lawful equality for the physical inequality that nature has imposed on men, so that, although unequal in strength or intellect, they all become equal by convention and legal right. So they can all just be all the same. The sovereignty of the state is, of course, the general will incarnate. He says sovereignty, being nothing but the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and the sovereign power, which is only a collective being, can be represented by itself alone. So essentially, the dictator always represents the entire civilization. And
interestingly, if you get tyrants from like Saddam Hussein to all of them,
any of them,
they all believe that they are representing the people. Everybody creates this a narrative that suits their situation and suits what they're doing. So they all believe that they're a lot of them believe that they're delivered by God. I mean, North Korea is a classic example of that. But they believe that they're a benign force doing the best for their people, even when they're torturing people.
Yeah.
They convince themselves that the people being tortured are evil.
They're literally, I mean, especially the communist and sort of fascist and French revolutionaries, they're literally torturing people in the name of their own rights.
Yeah.
These are the rights of man that we're here to enforce. These are your human rights that we're here to enforce. And you're evil, and now we're going to torture you. It's like, well, how did I lose those? When did I stop being a man, right?
Yeah.
But this is because the general will, as expressed by the sovereign, is infallible in this view, right? He says, the general will is always right and always tends to the public advantage. It does not follow that the resolutions of the people always have the same rectitude. So the state is infallible, and it is the people who are wrong.
Right.
You see how we get here?
Yeah.
It's like, it's unbelievable, isn't it? This is like what essentially can be called like French social contract theory.
Yeah.
And that's different to English social contract theory, which we'll go through in a minute, right? But the point is, the state has absolute power over all of the citizens, and anyone who attacks the constructed rights by the state becomes an enemy of the state, right? Listen to this. Every evildoer who attacks the social rights becomes by his crimes a rebel and traitor to his country. By violating its laws, he ceases to be a member of it and even makes war upon it. He has broken the social treaty, and consequently he is no longer a member of the state. If you misgender someone, you are now an enemy of the state.
Yeah.
That's this view. Because if you can
that's actually pretty much the view of the state right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. If you go against what is, this social contract, the right that's been made up by the state, you're an enemy of the state, and not just an enemy of the state, you're making war upon the state by contradicting this. And so he says this person ought to be cut off from it by exile as a violator of the compact, or by death as a public enemy. For such an enemy is not a moral person, he is simply a man. And this is a case where you essentially have a right to slay the vanquished, he says.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. The enemy is not a moral person. As soon as you criticize
dehumanize.
Exactly. So as soon as you contradict a progressive, you're no longer a moral person. You did something terrible, and therefore you're not a part of my group. You're outside of the compact. And so this is the French view of rights that the Democrats hold to.
But I take it this is the French view that was that written very soon after the French Revolution or during the French?
This is what inspired the French Revolution.
Right. So this was a sort of replacement for a feudal system. So this wasn't although I mean it sounds like it could have been written in any university between the 1960s and now. But this isn't a sort of contemporary. This is sort of unreformed. Unreformed.
Don't worry, I'm watching the time.
No.
This is the Rousseau's theory which led to the French Revolution. Right? And we compare this, by the way, for anyone who's wondering, you can learn more about this and the alternative to this in one of our previous book clubs, which were, in fact, this most recent one, which is Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution. He's speaking about the consequences of all of these ideas and saying you've gone mad and you're murdering people in the streets and you're, arresting your own king and tearing down your own civilization for what, And so if you want to know about that, go and look at that. But the American Republic, the United States, is not built on French social contract theory. It's built on English social contract theory, which is markedly different.
Yeah.
We have a book club. It's way better. And I'm not just saying that because I'm English. I'm saying that is because you don't murder people and turn the state into a living deity, right? We did a book club on this, of course, John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which is very important in this conversation, and that American Republicans should be able to cite just on a whim, right? So Locke's view is that the rights that we possess are our natural rights, and they're given to us by God. They are not constructed by the state.
Yeah.
In the state of nature, we exercise these rights, and as Hobbes famously put it, and as Locke partially at least concurs, the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So we come together to form governments for the protection of our natural rights, and we do this by sacrificing certain freedoms. We can't just murder each other. We can't just, steal people's property, things like this.
Yeah.
And
though, I mean, traditionally, people have said that your rights end where my safety or my, your freedoms end where my safety is in danger.
Well,
my rights are in danger.
Yeah.
But that's now being sort of subverted by safetyism in society.
Yes.
So people are saying, if you do something that's misgendering me, it's making me unsafe.
Yeah.
Where it's not. A lot of times it's a legitimate mistake, or you just haven't put the effort in and you
or
look
I
like
don't
a bloke.
owe you calling you a specific gender.
Yeah,
Get fucked.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, It's a nice thing to do. But it's one of those things like the NHS, it's a nice thing to have. But honestly, if you've put no effort into looking like the gender that you want to be referred to as, why is my brain having to do the heavy lifting in your transition?
But that's the point, isn't it? Because they come from the opinion that, the state has constructed a right not to be offended.
Yeah.
And so you're now obligated. And it's like, no, I'm not. I don't believe in state-constructed rights. So why would I think so?
So when people complain about comedians telling jokes, they say, oh, this joke made me feel unsafe. And then it's unsafe, so then removes the comedian's freedom to tell that joke. When in fact, they're perfectly safe because they're in a comedy club and not in the front line of the Somme, which is where they were.
That's exactly right, though. That's exactly right. And so it's these two different worldviews that we see at play. And so basically, Locke's like, well, look, people come together to form a government for the protection of these rights and to manage the ability for them to live side by side.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have certain person wants to do X, other person wants to do Y. There needs to be a legal decision made about this, right? In order to secure our life, liberty, and property, basically, right? It's completely sensible. Doesn't lead to insane purges or godlike dictators or anything like that. It's totally sensible and normal, right? And so if men are laboring under a government that they feel doesn't suit their sensibilities, they're totally, exactly. But they're totally free to change it, right? They're totally at liberty to change it because there's nothing sacred about a government building. The government is just something we constructed for our own ends. And if we don't like it, we can deconstruct it because it's ours. We pay for it. It serves us. We don't serve it. It's the total opposite of Rousseau's view where, the government owns everything and you are its pawn, And so in this view, nothing is sacred about the state at all. And it's interesting that both Locke and Rousseau were very religious men. And it's, Locke doesn't create a sacrilegious view of the state, whereas Rousseau does create a sacrilegious view where the state is given the power of God. But anyway, so Locke ends up with just, a constitutionally limited government that is there to protect the rights and the property of the men who own it themselves. It's not owned by the state. It's the complete opposite. And so you can see this in almost any Republican talking. Like this is just the first example of Republicans complaining about the capital isn't sacred. Why would you say that? There's nothing sacred about this because Liz Cheney, who calls herself a Republican, had also said that the Capitol building was the most sacred space in our republic. There's nothing sacred about a republic. It's literally, as far as you're concerned, Lockean style, it's you come together to institute your own government. And if you don't like it, you can just burn it down. It's yours. You pay for it. For the love of God. And this is why the libertarians were just openly celebrating Insurrection Day. You're starting to win me back over, libertarians, just so you know. But anyway, very briefly,
niggling with your buddies.
I mean, just what makes them like it's the American Republic. If it could ever be said that the Americans think government is sacred, how did they ever revolt from the British?
Yeah.
I mean, the king was literally put there by God.
Government has to be changeable. It absolutely has. I mean, I can't remember who it was, like Tom Wolfe or someone said, government and nappies need to be changed regularly and for the same reason. Anybody who's in power for a significant amount of time, as you'll see if you look to Scotland, like look at North Korea, things tend to atrophy and power collects and it becomes a feudal system, and everything that the French Revolution was there to overturn. So I mean, I understand that the guy Rousseau, who's writing about a more idealized model of government after the Revolution.
Oh no, this was before. This was before to overthrow the government and put in a more idealized system of government. He hadn't been exposed to modern Western democracy. He didn't know the consequences.
He didn't know how good things could be.
That's exactly
it. It seemed like you see that communist regimes tend to come into play to replace extremely horrible dictators.
Sure.
Rather than to replace free democracy. But I mean, I'm worried in the West that we're really being sort of lured down this track of and it's happening.
Well, let me show you
happening
how.
on the slide with government share of GDP is just increasing.
Let me show you how. Right, I did a video about this because I've been going through on the other channel, just lotuscaesar.com. I've been explaining critical race theory because it's pretty cancerous, to be honest. And part 3, I'll be recording part 4 this afternoon, but part 3 is how they substituted Locke for Rousseau. And they did this consciously. So I can't remember the title of the essay that I'm examining in this one, but in one of the essays, the critical race theorists just explicitly and self-consciously say, we don't like Lockean assumptions. Like we don't like that Locke thinks that we did this, this, and this, and we don't agree with that. We agree with Rousseau, and he expressly says this because the difference is contained about the basic assumption of what a human being is. Locke follows the Hobbesian model of saying, well, human beings are basically bad and they need to be civilized by society. This is why we need good institutions, good laws, and respect for one another.
Yeah.
Whereas the Rousseauian position is man is inherently good. The savage man is a good man. And therefore, anyone who creates a civilization is tainting that man. He's corrupting that man with civilization. So we are corrupted by our civilizations. This is why everything is about tearing down what already exists in order to return to this perfect state of being where we were just, like people in the Garden of Eden or something, right? And it's ridiculous. This is definitely not the case. Civilization is there to civilize us. And so I'll leave links to all of this in the description so you can go and watch and go through these at your own time. But I'm explaining everything about what I've said here because I've had to very quickly summarize it. But anyway, just the final thing here, right? You can see this teacher who's saying, well, look, we want a multiracial democracy versus white supremacy. What they're really saying here is we want Rousseau's communist dictatorship versus Locke's American Republic.
And it's creating a straw man. It's creating this thing that doesn't. There is no white supremacy, white supremacist system in the United States. They've got a lot of throughout business, throughout society, throughout politics. You've got a lot of representation of different ethnic groups, and also Trump increased his share of the ethnic vote.
Yeah.
So
but that's the point. The fact they're characterizing it as white supremacy, what they're characterizing as white supremacy is Lockean republicanism. Yeah. Right. It's the idea that people can manage their own affairs and don't need to be governed by the state and aren't wards of the state. Whereas the multiracial democracy is the Rousseauian view that the democracy is sacred and owns everything within it, and therefore is free to engineer the society however it likes it. And this is what we're seeing.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the content we have on the site, such as this article from Hugo that is free, which is Why the Housing Crisis is Happening, in which he explores the real issues about why we have such a crisis in the West. If you'd like to find out what else is coming out on the website, you can always go to getter.com and follow us at lotuseaters_com. Thank you and goodbye.